There are a lot of fantastic business people in Hong Kong and they're terrific, but Jimmy was just something else. He's cut from very different cloth. I mean, he's like nobody else I ever met.
Hello, listeners. Welcome back to Peking Hotel. I'm your host, Leo. Very happy Lunar New Year to you all. Hope you and all your families and friends a wonderful, happy, healthy year of the horse. And many of you may have seen the news that Jimmy Lai, the Hong Kong media tycoon and key leader in the pro-democracy movement throughout the 2010s, was sentenced to 20 years of imprisonment for sedition and collusion with foreign forces. This episode is our attempt to recount Jimmy Lai's legacy, the Hong Kong that it once was, the promise of one country, two systems, and an ever-receding vision for freedom and democracy in the city. I am honored to be chatting with Mark Clifford, a veteran journalist in Hong Kong who once served as the editor-in-chief of South China Morning Post, is the president of Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation, and perhaps most relevant to this episode, he is also Jimmy Lai's biographer. And so, without further ado, let's hear Mark talk about the Hong Kong he remembers and how Beijing broke it and lost it. Well, welcome to the series, Mark.
Great to be here. Thanks for your interest.
No, thank you for joining us. So moving to Hong Kong, what was the energy of Hong Kong like in the mid-90s? And that was also pre-handover.
Yeah. I mean, Hong Kong's energy, I haven't been back since right after the national security law came in, but from the day I arrived there, the night I arrived at the end of May 1987, I've just always loved Hong Kong. So as I said before, I went to Berkeley, loved the Bay Area, loved hiking, biking, being outdoors, ocean. And I love the intensity of an urban environment, the kind of like Manhattan. And so to me, like Hong Kong brings both of these things together. I also sailed a lot in Hong Kong, hiked a lot. Especially expatriate life in Hong Kong is incredible. But transportation, I like public transportation. I mean, the only downside to me, politics aside, for Hong Kong is, the bicycling is no good. The traffic is too insane. But the energy, it's the most amazing place that I've ever seen. I mean, part of it, I realized later, was really driven by insecurity and the fact that, wages in Hong Kong are very low. There isn't much of a social safety net. But just the hustle and the drive and the dynamism, the fact that you can just, set a company up, set your own business up. Government was very light touch government then. It wasn't just the taxes were low. Actually, the things I hate about taxes in the U.S. tax form is just the complexity of it. Hong Kong taxes, you could do them, it would take 20 minutes. It was one piece of paper. Probably it took longer to log on to the website than it did to actually fill out the form. I mean, so, but yeah, in Hong Kong, but you also really knew, you were at the center of Asia, 5-hour flying time. You could be everywhere from Delhi to Beijing to Tokyo. It just, it's just no place like it in the world. But also, you were on the edge. It was the whole borrowed city, borrowed time, mantra of Richard Hughes. And so, I came 5 years almost to the day until the handover. So it was 3 years after Tiananmen, 5 to go. The clock was ticking.
When did you first meet Jimmy Lai?
I met Jimmy Lai a year later as part of my duties as a correspondent, profiling him and Giordano and this crazy guy who was starting a media business. It started a magazine right after Tiananmen and had his eyes on opening up a newspaper right before the handover. And so, yeah, that was the beginning of, I've known him for 30 years. It obviously changed my life immensely, knowing him and eventually going on the board of directors at Next Digital.
In fact, the day of the handover, where were you then? Do you still remember the day?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Well, I went to, I don't remember the whole day, but I went as dusk fell, I went to the old Tamar Basin where they had a I don't know, it's a stage, is not really an auditorium. It's outside. Chris Patton spoke and Prince Charles spoke, and I guess the agreement was that if it was raining when Patton left Government House, they would cancel the outdoor ceremony, and it wasn't. But it started raining while he was on the way, even though it's only a couple of minutes. And so they had the ceremony, and it was raining increasingly hard. As a matter of fact, I had my passport in my back pocket. It got all the ink got all blurred, and Prince Charles. They both gave quite incredible speeches, and I guess the Black Watch. There was a final retreat. But I just remember Charles speaking, with, I don't even think an aide was holding an umbrella. Maybe an aide tried to come and hold an umbrella and he kind of shooed them away. And yeah, it was incredibly moving. I was, then I was at the Royal Hong Kong Yacht Club and Britannia. I guess that was after midnight. Then Britannia came out and the ship with Patton and King Charles went down the harbor. People were cheering the whole way. I mean, not like cheering like they wanted them to be gone, but cheering in support. Then I went on a bus and went up to the border, the Shenzhen border. I'm not sure which border crossing I was at, and we watched the PLA troops come in, also in the pouring rain. It was one of the rainiest Junes and Julys, one of the rainiest summers in Hong Kong history, at least at that time. And yeah, watched all the troops come in. Many of them in open back trucks, standing at attention again with incredible rain coming down. And then
Wow.
came back and it was dawn. It was a very gray day, of course, still. And PRC flags just all over, new flags just all over the city that had been raised. And I think it's when I saw those flags that it really hit me. Yeah, this is now part of China.
Yeah. What were you feeling at the time? Hopeful, pessimistic, neutral?
I mean, I think all of the above. I mean, I think everybody hoped for the best, and I was, quite pro-engagement, having seen the huge democratic changes in Korea and in Taiwan. And despite the horrors of the Tiananmen killings, wanting to believe that the same thing could happen with China, and knowing that, again, with June 4th in mind, but still knowing that the Chinese had the Sino-British Declaration, that even after the Tiananmen killings, had come out with the Basic Law, and were doing what they could to keep their promises for Hong Kong. So of course we hope that. But on the other hand, I had the example, I had seen Jimmy Lai a few weeks earlier at an event at the Grand Hyatt Hotel in Hong Kong with Al Newharth, who is the head of Gannett, the founder of USA Today, as the interlocutor. And Jimmy, there were probably 500 people there. The ballroom was jammed. Maybe there were more. And Jimmy broke down and started crying and said that he expected he'd go to jail after the communists took over. So, here's a guy who had a lot more direct experience with communism than me. And of course, I'd met Jimmy a few years earlier in 1993. So it was really sobering for me.
You arrived in Hong Kong as a reporter for Far Eastern Economic Review, moved to Business Week, and then you were the editor-in-chief for two Hong Kong newspapers. Could you talk about those experiences?
Yeah, no, that was a huge change for me. So let's see, end of 2003. No, sorry, end of 2002. So beginning of 2003. It took over as publisher and editor-in-chief at the Standard, which was the number two English language papers at that point. And so I had been in Hong Kong for just over 10 years and always been part of the foreign media. I mean, Far Eastern Economic Review, I mean, it's Hong Kong based, but it's English. It's mostly foreigners working there and working around the region. So, actually it's one of the best things. I mean, it just was so interesting for me because, all of a sudden I was much more in Hong Kong, right? I'm going out to dinners with ministers and, just me and, being on a radio show with Lee Chuck Yen, the unionist. I mean, just involved a lot more with Hong Kong people, Hong Kong issues, not just going to the airport every couple of weeks and going to India or Malaysia or Indonesia. And I mean, the thing that I'd say one story kind of encapsulates it. The guy who used to had been cutting my hair since about 1994 or something. Um, he always used to tell me that Hong Kong people didn't care about politics. And as soon as I joined the Standard, really, of course I knew he hadn't been telling me the truth, but he opened up. And so wow, every time I go for the next almost 20 years, we would talk about politics. And he was so engaged. And, I think many Hong Kongers just keep it, they have so many Guailos, so many foreigners there. And most of the people just stay a few years. Almost none of us, including me, despite my efforts, speak Cantonese. And they just figure, no sense in like trying to explain Hong Kong to foreigners. And so it's easier to just say, oh, we don't care about politics, right? But then you get beneath the surface. And I mean, this guy, here he was with a daughter, owned an apartment, devout Christian. He's the kind of person that in most countries would be like solid, very conservative, supporter of, conservative politicians probably. This guy hated the communists. He was young. He was born in Hong Kong. I mean, he was much younger than me. And hated the communists. Would, I'd usually get my hair cut after work, and then he'd be like, "Okay, I'm going off to he was going off to Joshua Wong's, scholarism demonstrations in 2012. I mean, before Occupy started, he said, I might have to close my shop. I'm going to go down to Occupy. And, this guy I found out so much, and the point is, when you're working in a Hong Kong publication and you're just dealing with Hong Kong people, there's a richness and a texture to the city. I can't say that I mean, I don't speak, Cantonese with any fluency at all. And so I can't really claim to be a Hong Konger the way that like, a Cantonese person is. But, it just gave me a sense of the texture and the richness and the beauty and the vibrancy of the place in a way that I hadn't had before. And obviously I, met many, many, many more Hong Kong people. And so, yeah, it was just a really sweet, sweet time.
What's the relationship between the Hong Kong press and Beijing at the time?
Interesting you ask. English language press is easier, although the Hong Kong Standard was part of the Tsingtao family, owned by a guy named Charles Ho, who came out of the Hong Kong tobacco family, took over the newspaper after the previous owner, Sally Aw, went bankrupt, basically. Or I don't know if she went bankrupt, but anyway, there were financial things. She lost it. And it's interesting because the paper had been founded by Sally's father, who was Abun Seng, I think, soon, had been the guy who invented Tiger Balm. And they wanted it to be an alternative to the South China Morning Post. But it was very kind of pro KMT, pro nationalist and more Chinese. And it was had a Chinese editor in chief decades, I think, before the South China Morning Post did, which is much more of a British colonial and racist publication, quite frankly, in terms of its staffing. Luckily, I was mostly spared that, but Charles and the team at Tsingtao were, they were in very close contact with the people in Beijing, or with the Beijing representatives in Hong Kong. And, they were often seen as a government mouthpiece. They were much more likely to criticize the Hong Kong government than to criticize anything with Beijing. And Charles died, I guess, earlier this year, 2025. And, he was very good to me, but I was sorry for his cynicism because he knew how bad the Chinese communists were, and yet he cynically played along because he liked the power, he liked the glory, he liked the money.
And what does it mean to play along? I mean, it was the newspaper receiving, political lines to take? Was it?
Sure. I mean, as far as I understand, Singh certainly was it a political line? Was he getting a call? I don't know exactly the mechanism, but they were often taking leaks and they were, yeah, I don't know who was giving them the line, but somebody was giving them a line that they wanted to take. Was it official or was it, one person's, one senior government official's view?
I can't answer that, but they consistently reflected government and Beijing views. But as I say, we were it's funny being running an English speaking publication. We didn't matter as much in Hong Kong after 1997, so they kind of left us alone. We had a lot of freedom. We won a lot of awards. We It was a very scrappy, hard-hitting paper. After I've been there a couple of years, I met the Kwok's, Ian Hoy, Robert Kwok, and their family owned most of the South China Morning Post, and they were looking for a new editor in chief. So talked to them, went across the street or across the harbor actually, but yeah. And the Kwok's, when I later worked at South China Morning Post, I mean,
Yeah.
look, these people were pretty close to senior people in the administration at the time. And I think it's one of the dangers of media ownership, that's done, by somebody who has a lot of other business interests and will be tempted to bend their coverage, their editorial. Well, they'll sacrifice their editorial independence because of concern about their other interests. And I think that was true with both the Kwok's and with Charles. Now, I don't want to impugn their integrity by suggesting that there's a direct line between, a particular story and something else, and a particular business interest. But I think in general, they were reluctant to go as hard as a completely independent publication could have been, like Apple Daily and Jimmy Lai. When Jimmy was faced with pressure from the Chinese on his other main interest, Giordano, he sold his Giordano stake, and we didn't see that happen at the South China Morning Post or at the Standard. They had other interests, and so that was an issue. There wasn't a lot of really direct editorial interference. Again, at the SCMP or the Standard, the Kwok's or Charles might make it clear that they weren't so happy about something, but like, so what? Sometimes I was told I shouldn't have so and so as a columnist because I think of this one guy, Steve Vines. They said he was too vinegary. Ian Kwok told me that, but I had him as a columnist anyway, and that was that. Of course, they didn't renew my contract after a year either, and I think this gets back to, yeah, an encounter I had with Rafael Hoy when he was chief secretary, and I said that it was kind of an answer to a question like yours, that the press was really important in Hong Kong, and it was particularly important um, until Hong Kong had universal suffrage, had full democracy. Rafael then told told the Kwok's that I said that the SCMP would oppose the government until there was full democracy, which is just nonsense. That wasn't the role of the SCMP. But those kinds of pressures are very real, and that was that's probably what cost me the non-renewal of my contract.
And after leaving South China Morning Post, you left journalism and became the executive director at the Hong Kong Asia Business Council for 13 years. What led to that decision? That was quite a different place to work.
I'd kind of done what I could do in journalism, right? I mean, I didn't want to leave Hong Kong. I'd run the two English language newspapers. Like, what else was there to do in journalism, really? Along the way, did a couple of books, got my PhD, started working on a couple more books. So, and got to interact with some of the, I guess, most powerful, interesting people running some of the largest companies in Asia, if not the world, from Saudi Aramco to Mizuho Bank to some of the big, Southeast Asian family-owned and Korean companies, CEOs and chairmen. So, yeah, just different challenge. I just kind of go where the opportunities are. And so I think the kind of underlying, often unspoken message behind or reason behind the Asia Business Council was to try to knit together this private sector ties. And I remember the first meeting in New Delhi, which would have been late 2007. During a coffee break, one of the members said to the another member, "Oh, You own an airline? I own an airline too. We should talk. So, it was like, these really high level private sector conversations. So I used to work really hard on, reports and, having great speakers and sessions at these semi-annual meetings. But what I learned is what really mattered was the social engineering of the coffee breaks and the lunches and the dinners and the other things, because that's where people got to know each other, got a level of trust.
And your time in Hong Kong overlapped with so many political events, not just the handover, but also major demonstrations such as the massive 2003 protest about Article 23, Beijing's first attempt to impose national security legislation. Could you talk about those and how did you see and experience them at the time?
Of course, the backdrop of China's entry into the WTO. I think I mentioned the book that I wrote with Supachai Panajpak. And then, of course, before the Article 23, we had SARS and the government's inept handling of that in 2002, early 2003. And I mention that because, of course, after SARS and after the Article 23, the 2003 demonstration, I think China took a much more active hand in Hong Kong. And one of the things they did, of course, was open up to tourism, and they really eased up on the visas. So that you have to also see the broader international context of China opening up, getting the Olympics, of course, in which they had in 2008. And on the one hand, people feeling very, very positive. If you look at the polling about, I don't have the exact numbers, but Hong Kongers felt more quote unquote Chinese that was growing in that whole period, and then peaked in 2008. And then the sense of Hong Kong identity became stronger, and the sense of being Chinese receded. So, we had a lot of cross currents at that point in terms of internationally.
Yeah. So where were you in 2003 when the
Good
march
question.
happened?
Yeah, no, I was, I was, yeah, as you know, I was not an activist, and I was a journalist. I was still working for Business Week, and I was at the JW Marriott Hotel, actually with a guy named Mark Simon, who had just started working for Jimmy Lai a couple of years earlier, and we just watched these hundreds of thousands. So the JW Marriott Hotel is right on Queensway, and where the tram tracks are and things. And it was a brutally hot day, over 90 degrees, and we just in air conditioned comfort, drinking iced tea, just watched these hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people go by. And I mean, that was a signal moment. You knew something had changed in Hong Kong that day. There was, I mentioned that whole backdrop. China's growing. China's taken over Hong Kong, but they seem to have a pretty light hand. SARS doesn't go well, but all these people come out. The government withdraws Article 23. Teng Chee-hwa steps down about it. So China seemed to have a light hand and yet still be responding to aspirations. People still felt optimistic that the basic law would be respected. There have been promises that there'd be a full universal suffrage for the 2007 alleged elections, and then in the run-up to the Olympics, the WTO. And there was lots of good momentum, and the bad stuff hadn't kicked in yet. It's like a honeymoon period for the first 5, 8 years, and everybody's on good behavior, and then tempers start fraying. Specific things happen. Article 23, the abortive reform of a couple of years later under Donald Zhang. I feel like there were a couple of other things, but then both sides start mistrusting the other one more. So I think the seeds of an inevitable clash were there, irrespective, and prior to Xi Jinping, and even prior to him, when he was vice premier, he took over. He ran the leading group, on Hong Kong and Macau. So. But I think that the frictions predate that. I think actually, although I naively thought otherwise, that in retrospect, a CCP just demands control and subservience, and they somehow thought they could get that from Hong Kong, and they weren't going. That was not in the cards. So I really was a tragedy in the Greek sense of both sides are kind of fated to clash just because of who their characters are.
And so fast forward to 2014, umbrella movement, you already left journalism, entered business council into the business world. Where were you, during those weeks, months of Occupy Central, and what do you see?
Ironically, I had started my PhD program like exactly when Occupy started in August
Mm.
2014. I mean, Occupy really started a couple weeks later. So, in fact, that first night, that Sunday in September, there were some clashes, and Joshua Wong went over the fence into the administrative compound on Friday night, was arrested. There was more agitation Saturday night. He got out, and then when they really took over and occupied things was on the, and there were 87 volleys of tear gas fired. That was on the Sunday late afternoon. Funnily enough, I was in the library and then coming home, I just, because I just been in the library all day and, I was working full time. I was at HKU, but obviously I'm not like part of the student union or anything. And so I just took a long walk from HKU up over the peak and down to my apartment and in mid levels. And then I found out I got a note, a text from a friend in London. I didn't know what it was about, but it was just she was outraged at what the Hong Kong police had done to the demonstrators. And then I went down there that evening and saw a lot of the skirmishing and smelled the tear gas. I mean, it wasn't like right up close, but yeah, it was pretty close to what was going on. And yeah, I remember it very, very vividly. So, and obviously, it was in Central for 79 days. So. It was pretty incredible, honestly. I mean, it's, historically so unique, right? I mean, what major city allows like a 79-day occupation? And you have to give the Hong Kong authorities and the Beijing authorities, high marks for their tolerance. You give them low marks for actually knowing how to negotiate a compromise and a way forward, because I think we still could have found one then. But you have to give them very high marks to diffusing the situation without violence.
How did the Business Council react to the umbrella movement in 2014?
I don't remember talking with them that much about it. I know that Ronnie Chan was, who was the founder of the Business Council, but wasn't on the board anymore. I mean, he was a big supporter of CY Leung, and he was somebody who just detested Jimmy Lai. So, I don't think he was, I wouldn't expect them to be positive. It wasn't something I'd sit around and talk to them a lot about either.
I think there is an understanding that Beijing obviously eventually grew discontent with the situation in Hong Kong and wanted the government to clean up things and restore order and restore party control. And there's frustration that the Hong Kong tycoons never really pushed back or play their role in the movement and sort of just play the role of the colonial elites who would rule on behalf of Beijing. And if the tycoons are not in it with the people, then there's no chance of succeeding. I mean, what do you make of this interpretation of the serious events in Hong Kong?
Yeah, well, I think you mentioned restore party control. We never really had party control in Hong Kong. So I'm not sure that that's a good starting point. I don't think that there is any, I mean, I think your characterization is correct, but I don't think there was really any serious expectation that the business community would, would join with people. I mean, I don't want to say they were marginal, but in the end, they were marginalized. I think the business community is one of the biggest reasons for Hong Kong's stunted political development. And if you go back to even the 1950s, the Hong Kong and the the Chinese and the kind of, I guess, white British business establishment pushed back hard. Actually, late 1940s, the Young Plan, Mark Young's plan to introduce, even the beginnings of more representative government. And the business community really pushed back. And at the same time, or a few years later, really, Zhou Enlai and Beijing put out word that any move towards, I mean, they were worried about Dominion status. I think they were worried about a kind of Singapore breakaway solution. They put out word that would be met really seriously. And so I think anyway, there's a long history of the business community, both Chinese and British, opposing democracy in Hong Kong. And I don't think, so I don't know. I happen to know that as a student of Hong Kong history, Did the student protesters know that or not know that and have unrealistic expectations? I don't know, but I was never surprised that the business community was always in line with the government. Sometimes I think they have to hold their nose and just say what the party line is, just as they do in many countries. I think, it's pretty hard as a business person when you can be punished by the government. Um, but yeah, I think they were marginal players, and I think if Beijing had decided something different, then we could have had something different. And it would have been really unusual for the business community to go the other way. I mean, the closest you can see is Cathay sound, a lot, Cathay obviously had thousands, tens of thousands of workers, and some of them were very involved with the movement, and the Cathay management was not going to punish them, and for that, the Cathay management got punished, and the CEO was fired. So, and that person at least was British, so he could leave, but I don't think any Hong Kong Chinese businessman was gonna risk all their
Yeah.
wealth and their assets to in what in a pro-democracy movement.
I mean, here's the part where Jimmy Lai is really the critical figure, right? Because in some sense he's the only one who, at his level, really stood up for the rights and the autonomy and dignity and the liberty and the democracy of Hong Kong. And could you talk about how you grew to know him and how you grew to understand him a bit better and how your interest in him over time
Sure.
became significant?
I met Jimmy in 1993. I profiled him for the Far Eastern Economic Review. It was the
Yeah.
first time I met him. First of several profiles I wrote on him. I would, so I've known him for more than 30 years. I would not characterize myself as being part of his inner circle. I mean, I knew him pretty well. I'd see him a couple times a year. Often go out on his boat, or he'd invite people out on his boat, journalists, priests, visiting scholars. I mean, very eclectic group of people, and his dinner parties were kind of the same. There might be a missionary priest, and you might be next to a Nobel Prize winning economist, or or Anson Chan might be there. It's a very eclectic group of people, and we differ on a lot of things, but I just thought he was, from the beginning. It was before. So 93, he had founded Next Magazine, but he hadn't founded Apple Daily yet. And, he described to me what he was going to do with this newspaper. And I can't remember exactly what my reaction was, but, it wasn't like newspapers were a growing business. The internet was starting. You could see, that newspapers, it was a risk. And, you know, China was coming to take over Hong Kong. So it seemed a little bit crazy, but he really approached it as a business person. He approached it as a business person and as somebody who loved freedom, because he knew that Hong Kong people overwhelmingly supported democracy. And 6 out of 10 Hong Kongers had voted for the pro-democracy candidates in the 1991 election, which was really the first territory-wide election ever, after 150 years of British rule. And he knew there was a market. He went through in that first lunch, I was pretty new to Hong Kong. He went through every single newspaper, who owned them, what their line was, and how they were already started to make adjustments to get ready for the coming of CCP rule. And so he just realized that he had a golden business opportunity. It's a bit like the way Warren Buffett thinks about businesses. It's like if you have a moat around your business, a protective moat, it's a great thing. And Jimmy had a protective moat, which was basically fear of the CCP. So he had a product that people wanted on his island, and he had protection because nobody else was going to dare to swim across the shark-infested waters, I guess. And he was right. But he was also, he's a great businessman, and he wasn't just feeding people spinach and hard politics. I mean, it was very colorful. He bought beautiful colored, fantastic world-class presses, and first guy to start printing color in Hong Kong. And, obviously lots of very, very lively stories, sensationalism, sex, sin, sensationalism mixed with, a real commitment to free markets and free people. I mean, actually, Jimmy was very open ideologically, and in talking to reporters,
they said they got like there was less censorship than anywhere they ever worked, less editorial kind of oversight and control. The only thing is, if you were writing about economic stuff and he thought you were writing kind of socialist, leftist stuff, he hated that and you were out.
Mm.
But you could write, politically just about anything. But yeah, it was a kind of a mixture of cotton candy and broccoli. It was just like all over the place. But from the beginning, it was a very powerful, very important paper, and it did really serious investigative work. I mean, starting with Next Magazine, which started in 1990, 5 years earlier, and then continuing. Next was more the serious investigative stuff, but there was a lot of investigative stuff that Apple did. One of the things that helped fuel the anger in 2003 was so-called LexisGate with Anthony Long, the finance secretary, who bought himself a new Lexus immediately before he raised the taxes on cars and saves himself, by memory, a few tens of thousands of dollars. It was Apple that broke that. Apple broke something about a legislator who hadn't declared interests, and he went to jail for that. So I mean, it's just hard to pigeonhole Apple. I don't know of another paper in the world that's kind of had that broad popular appeal and also had like a lot of really serious stuff. And so, it also, more importantly, broke up the cozy relationship that existed between the press and government and business people. I mean, Apple was a no holds barred kind of place. And, that ethos was set from the top.
You later joined the board of Apple Daily's parent company, Next Digital. What prompted you to join the board?
I went on the board in 2018, so it was pretty late. And I went on with Gordon Krovitz, who had been my boss at the Far Eastern Economic Review. And I had, in fact, introduced Jimmy to Gordon in 93 or 94. Yeah, then Gordon introduced Bill McGurn to him. Bill became his godfather when Jimmy converted to Catholicism in 97. So, although, a lot of us had very different politics, I think we loved Hong Kong and we were really just loved the sense of freedom that Hong Kong exemplified. And that when Jimmy was kind of a pole of that, and he was so different from other people. There are a lot of fantastic business people in Hong Kong and they're terrific, but Jimmy was just something else. He's cut from very different cloth. I mean, he's like nobody else I ever met. I didn't try to force my relationship with Jimmy, and I was delighted when I was asked on the board. And as I said, so Gordon Krovitz was asked on at the same time. He had been publisher of the Wall Street Journal, and Gordon and I, were really interested. We weren't, we're not experts in Hong Kong politics, and so we were particularly interested in trying to help the paper make the transition from paper to online. And the real challenge was to get Hong Kongers to pay for news online. And there have been some abortive attempts before, but Gordon had a lot of experience at that from his time at the Journal, and so that was the attraction.
Yeah, and I guess you joined at a pretty momentous time.
Yeah, but it didn't seem like that at the time. 2018 seemed like it was a lull,
Yeah.
It's only in retrospect that it looks like it was momentous.
So could you walk us through those months leading up to, obviously, summer 2019 and through the summer?
Yeah, I mean, nothing particularly, we'd have quarterly board meetings, there was a lot to go through. Yeah, I had just finished my PhD. I think I'd submitted it and done my orals, or my defense, I think was in March, around then. So yeah, I was just waiting to get my diploma, which I never got because that guy Zhang, the vice chancellor, decided to cancel the ceremony in December. I'm quite mad. And so, but so I mean, look, it was kind of crazy time, right? Like you could go out and you could, completely miss, in most places in Hong Kong, things are fine. But on the other hand, there'd be, demonstrations in Central. I remember one time I'm in the FCC having lunch and there's tear gas coming in, and it was chaotic and violent in a way that 2014 had not been. Again, I think one of the remarkable things is how little physical violence there was. There was an older man who was killed by some protesters. I think they threw a brick or something.
I mean, I think that was that was accidental. I don't think it was intended to kill him. The protesters, of course, say some people were killed by police. But there was just much more brutality on both sides. I would say, especially from the police side. But there was a huge amount of property damage and vandalism from protesters. And I mean, I think you see it most explicitly with the MTR, which had been seen as something kind of pro people or at least neutral. And then at some point in July or August, started being seen as pro-government, and so then the MTR became this symbol, a symbol that then was people felt that they were, I don't know, justified in burning and just vandalizing the MTR, which I think was really unfortunate. And then, people were very targeted. They go after Bank of China or Starbucks, the Maxims family or the family that controlled Maxims that had the Starbucks family was seen, some remarks were made. So they were seen as pro-government. So, there was a lot of really unfortunate, I mean, quite shocking and absolutely unprecedented vandalism in Hong Kong at the time. And you could go out at night. I mean, it was weird. I was never, I don't think, right on the front lines. Definitely, ran up against a lot of police and just like walking around. I wasn't out there chanting or anything. I don't think, maybe a little bit. But my Cantonese isn't good enough. But so it's like there were demos, like I don't want to say all over the place. My office was at 98 Wellington Street, right by the escalator. So, quite close to Central. So I feel I saw there was a lot of action. And it always seemed very David versus Goliath, but the numbers were so huge. And I think what was more impressive to me was the marches, August 18th, I mean, just incredible crowds, June 9th, June 16th. These were all ones that I was at. Some of them I marched in, some of them I just watched. But, I don't think I'll ever in my life see crowds of this size. August 18th, I'd been out hiking, and then I wanted to catch the rally in Victoria Park, and there had been permission. They'd gotten government permission. And in an hour, I managed to get out of the subway station. I couldn't get more than 50 feet from maybe 100 feet, but you really could not move. And that was right next to the Sogo department store. So I'm still hundreds of meters from Victoria Park, absolutely unable to move. And that was the day. I mean, Jimmy Lai was jailed for leading people on a march out of Victoria Park, which was dangerously overcrowded. And he led people on a march down Hennessy and Queensway to Central and was convicted and jailed for leading an unauthorized demonstration. But I mean, just the crowds, just so peaceful. I mean, I have to contrast, the kind of scenes that I would see, at HKU and elsewhere where there was a lot of physical damage. And I think people were ready to hurt police and other people. I don't know how much they really did. And these huge marches that were, just such a cross section of Hong Kong people, really people of all ages. And I was going to say, I mean, obviously almost all Hong Kong Chinese, but just really, really diverse crowd. Probably more, upper middle class than like working class, but I don't really know. Sometimes hard to tell. But I think really just the diversity in age, the fact that people felt secure and safe in bringing, their really young kids or their parents or grandparents, So I just think it was people power of the most, really the most beautiful sort. And yet you had a government that never even offered to negotiate. They didn't even have fake negotiations. They just stonewalled. And I think that just drove people to, absolutely frustration, despair, and ultimately to violence. And I don't support that. I know Jimmy Lai didn't support it. People thought that Jimmy was too cautious, too nonviolent. But I think one can understand the slogan, which was, you taught us that peaceful protest doesn't work.
What clicked for you such that you decided to join the demonstration?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I wish I could find it. I wrote a piece for Apple called "Why I Marched," and after the June 9th march, because I'd been to the June 4th commemoration that, just a few days earlier. And as I said, I'd probably been to those 5 or 10 times in my 28 years in Hong Kong.
Yeah.
Or maybe in 2003, I was still a journalist and really felt bound by this need for neutrality. And by 2019, and I don't know, in 2014, I wasn't a journalist anymore, but I don't know. There was just something, maybe I'd stayed in Hong Kong so long, or maybe it was just like a bridge too far. This law, which was going to allow people to be extradited back to China, it just seemed like too much. And it was also, I guess, an accumulation of, it had been, what, 22 years since the handover, and China clearly was backpedaling on its promises. In 2017, the foreign ministry had declared that the Sino-British declaration was, I can't remember the exact language, of no practical relevance, a historical document. In other words, this was an international treaty that China was just going to rubbish. It clearly wasn't interested in living up to the basic law. And, I'd spent most of my adult life in Hong Kong, and I was just fed up with it. So, yeah, and I mean, peaceful protest is part of the Hong Kong tradition. So it seemed like, okay, might as well get out there with a million other Hong Kongers and, you know, do what I could. And, I mean, at that point too, it was, we didn't, get in this thing. It was like, my board knew that I was on the next digital board. They could, even though I was an independent non-executive director, they could draw their conclusions about where my political sympathies lay, even if not that I made any secret of it. And, there are just times when you just need to make a stand. I think that in retrospect that the late November district council elections in 2019, when Beijing, as usual, Beijing was out of touch with Hong Kong grassroots reality, and I think they've always been out of touch. And they really thought there was going to be a silent majority that was going to vote blue, vote pro Beijing, and instead you had this landslide victory and with record turnout, over 70% turnout for district council elections.
Yeah.
And I think I think at that point, Xi Jinping just said, we've lost Hong Kong.
On August 10th, 2020, was the raid at Apple Daily's office. Where were you that day, and what communication do you have with Jimmy or his staff?
Yeah, it's funny. Well, first of all, on I think February 28th, I was supposed to go have breakfast with him, and I was just getting in a taxi about 8 o'clock in the morning. I was supposed to be at his house at 8:30, and I get a call from his secretary saying, "Mr. Lai can't meet you today." And I'm kind of puzzled by this because, like Jimmy is, there's some CEOs, they're always late or, they cancel and things. Jimmy is always on time and he never cancels. First time, in all the years I'd known him. And then I saw an email from him that he'd actually sent me 15 or 20 minutes earlier saying, "I'm being arrested." And so, he'd been arrested in February. That was really not, that was pretty concerning, right? I saw him a week later. We had the breakfast and, everything kind of was fine, but he was, I think, a bit taken aback by this. But they were very proper. They let him finish his exercises, very civilized, take a shower, come down. They hold him a few hours and then he's out. August 10th was different, and I was in Hong Kong. I was in my office, and I was just following it through news reports. I had no contact with him. We were supposed to have our annual general meeting that day. I think that was a Monday, and I think the AGM was on a Thursday or a Friday. But anyway, we had an emergency board meeting, and it became clear during the course of the meeting that I was the only director in Hong Kong not in police custody. So not really a very good feeling, It's like, okay, I'm an American. I have no Chinese ancestry, so it's unlikely they're going to come after me, but still not a very good sign. And So I thought I was going to have to run the AGM, but they let Jimmy out, I guess, very late on the Tuesday night. And then he, was in the newsroom on Wednesday, and we had the AGM as usual. And but it's like, wow, okay, this is, it's funny because by then it seemed like the national security law had been in place for quite some time, but in fact it had been less than 6 weeks. Came in on
Yeah.
June 30th. And they also arrested Jimmy's sons from his first marriage, Tim and Ian. Um, and I think there was some talk about the private office, the sublet. So there are all these little things that didn't seem that important at the time, but are very important in retrospect. And then I left Hong Kong on October 27th that year. Um, and it was right after Asia Business Council had had one of its semi-annual meetings. It was remote, but we had a whole like production studio set up in Hong Kong. And um, I had been threatened on an open call during this meeting by Ronnie Chan, implicitly threatening me with arrest under the national security law. So that was not a very good feeling either. And I had planned to come back just for the Christmas holidays and then come back to Hong Kong and I had family in the States. Um, and then on, I guess it was December 3rd, I just bought my return ticket for early January. And then a day later, I think it was December 3rd, Jimmy's, bail was revoked. He was put in jail. My name was mentioned by the prosecutor, just saying something anodyne. Well, of course, we had been, not of course, but I should remind you, we had been doing these weekly live stream events that became an important part of the trial. In fact, we had everybody from Cardinal Zen to, I know, Chris Patton to Nathan Sharansky to Paul Wolfowitz on these programs. And I was the moderator and I would just keep things going. Sometimes Jimmy and the guest did most of the talking, as with Sharansky. Sometimes I had to intervene a lot, as with Cardinal Zen and Jimmy. So, and sometimes these things would have 200,000 people watching live or in the first 24 hours, and they'd be reported in the newspaper. So there was some profile. So that was probably the most kind of active thing that I did that would probably put me on the radar screen of authorities. Which I guess it did because they quoted me as saying Jimmy Lai is a symbol of Hong Kong resistance when they revoked his bail, which seems like pretty factual and pretty anodyne. So then I decided I decided to cancel my ticket, and then I honestly. I probably would have gone back, except that they kept extending the quarantine. And so the combination of, and then Jimmy got out for a few days over Christmas, then they put him back in on December 31st. Then they had the big raid of what became the Hong Kong 47 on January 6th, 2021. That was a crazy day in history. It starts off with, I think, raids on 75 apartments in Hong Kong and ends up with a, storming of the Capitol by the MAGA people. So very interesting day in history. Then I just, very naively, founded what became, with a few other people, founded what became this Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation. I mean, we were incredibly naive, but yeah, so the upshot was I just never went back to Hong Kong and just got involved in trying to do what we can for Jimmy, for the other six Apple Daily people who are in prison, and really for the 600 or so Hong Kong political prisoners. So it just developed very organically and very, very unexpectedly because I think I'm so naive. I'd never dealt with a communist, a Leninist party really close up like this before. And, the brutality with which, so sorry, I guess we got to jump ahead a little bit to later on in 2021. In May, Jimmy's shares were frozen. They tried to freeze some overseas bank accounts. And then in June, we got a letter from John Lee. The directors got a letter saying that he suspected we'd broken the national security law. Therefore, he was freezing bank accounts of three of the key subsidiaries. And so we were out of business, by the end of the month. And, several of my colleagues, six other colleagues besides Jimmy were rounded up and, remain in jail to this day.
You left the Asia Business Council in January 2021. How did that happen?
I think, I mean, I lost my job, or I offered to resign, and it was accepted because I knew that some of the members were uncomfortable with with the fact that I was a director of Next Digital, and and that I've been doing these live streams with Jimmy Lai.
You've written a biography of Jimmy Lai titled The Troublemaker. What's so special about Jimmy, in your opinion, that sets him apart? Is it the moral energy, the personal charisma? What is it?
Here's why I think he's unique among dissidents that the CCP has dealt with. I mean, because he has three things that they don't like and in some senses don't understand. The first two they understand. He's rich, so he can hire great lawyers. He has lots of well-connected friends around the world, this network, the sort that rich people have and the resources they have to make things happen. So, if he wanted umbrellas or he wanted anything, I mean, Jimmy put a lot, I didn't know all this, and it did come out in the trial. He put a huge amount of money into the movement. I mean, he spent more than 100 million US dollars of his own money on the
Oh, wow.
pro-democracy movement over the years. I mean, he basically, in that sense, I kind of see why the Chinese think he's a black hand. I think the movement would have been strong, and I think he was helping articulate and vocalize Hong Kong people's aspirations, but he really
Yeah.
put his money where his mouth was.
Yeah.
So, number one, he was rich and he had resources and he had his own power base. And of course, no Leninist party likes that at all. I mean, I even saw it in South Korea, Taiwan, even non-communist kind of one-party states don't like rich business people. Look what happened with Jack Ma and Alibaba. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, you know, even authoritarian governments really, really have a hard time with independent power bases and wealthy people. Number two, a lot of his power base is built around media, and I don't need to tell you what the CCP thinks of media. It's propaganda, and it should reflect the state line, and if it doesn't, it definitely should not oppose it. So, number one, the power that comes from wealth. Number two, the power that comes from media. Number three, the power that comes from actually having principles and convictions. And Jimmy was always a guy with a really strong sense of right and wrong. And he's principled, but he's also fearless. And he's by nature a troublemaker. That's where the title comes from. That's what he called himself. I said, "Why do you do this?" He said, "I don't know. I'm a troublemaker. It's just kind of born that way." And so, the wealth, media, and the sense of fearless, principled conviction, which was, as I said, he's always, since I've known him, been like that. But after his conversion to Catholicism, it was like that was turbocharged. So this combination, and so I think that the CCP understands the power and the wealth part. They understand the media part. I don't think they really understand principles. I mean, maybe the first generation of revolutionaries would, but the people running now, I don't think they have any principles. Maybe I'm wrong. But so the fact that Jimmy has these principles, he's fearless. He's not afraid to go to jail, maybe even to die in jail for these principles. I think, makes him unusual to me and also makes him an unusual threat to the CCP.
You call yourself the accidental dissident activist, I guess.
Accidental activist, no dissident, but anyway,
Yeah,
accidental
activist. Are you surprised by yourself in the direction that you've taken?
Well, I mean, yes and no. I mean, I've always interested in politics and, look, I went to Berkeley, so I also describe myself as a recovering leftist. So, I mean, but, my life
A
was
recovering
much
leftist wrestling with the Communist Party to save a billionaire.
a right-wing billionaire.
in the most capitalistic city in the world.
Yeah, so in that sense, I mean, yeah, it's surprising. So in that sense, I would not have predicted it, but it's not totally out of character,
Right. It's quite funny, isn't it? If we describe it that way, but so I think Apple Daily was kept going for a while, even after the raid and after Jimmy Lai was in and out of the prison.
Yeah, well,
detention.
but the presses stopped rolling, I think June 23rd or June 24th, 2021. I think June 24th was the last edition.
Yeah. Are you still in touch with the folks?
Some. I got to know more of them. Again, as a board member, it wasn't like I knew hundreds of reporters or journalists or anything like that. And, several of the ones I did know were in jail. So
But yeah, I'm in touch with some people. I mean, there's a huge amount of loyalty. I learned a lot writing this biography about Jimmy, but above all about the business. And he had such loyalty and so many. I mean, people, might have problems with one decision or another that he made, but
Mm.
I just think there's a huge amount of respect and a real fondness and, just incredible network in Taiwan and in Hong Kong. I think in Taiwan they had a big reunion, I think in August or something, and I'm told like 1,000 people signed up. I don't know how many people actually came. Really incredible. I mean, at its peak in the sort of the end of the 2000s, maybe around 2008, 2010. I think the whole organization had around 4,000 people. In 20 years, he'd gone from nothing, from just being in the clothing business to building the largest truly independent Chinese language media operation in the world, arguably.
And so you left Hong Kong. I mean, I guess not really with the intention of never returning, but the series of things caught you up and made you some kind of a diaspora from Hong Kong.
It's weird, yeah.
And so, have you been in touch with the overseas Hong Kong diaspora community? How has that new life looked for you?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, Leo. I mean, it's been a fantastic chapter, I have to say, although, I call myself an accidental activist. Honestly, it's the most satisfying work that I've ever done. I mean, I've enjoyed every job I've done. They've all been different. They've all been challenging in different ways, but this is satisfying because I feel it's for something that really matters. It's for a place that I love so much, where I spent most of my adult life. Um, and I just think the spirit of Hong Kong, individually, kind of and as a city is just something worth fighting for. Uh, because I do think, I digress a little bit. I do think that, I mean, Hong Kong matters for the future of a liberal international order. And if China's allowed to, with no resistance, just steamroll and destroy Hong Kong, it's bad for everybody who likes freedom. And I've been in touch a lot with diaspora people. I probably know more Hong Kongers now than I did when I was in Hong Kong. Maybe not, but I mean, I don't know, the intensity that people have for Hong Kong, and you don't want it, and I don't think anybody wants it to kind of just degenerate into kind of this wistful nostalgia. It's still a very lively and live culture, but it's unique. But we
Yeah.
have because of technology, we have possibilities that, let's say, the Hungarian refugees after 1956 just didn't have. They're split up into fragmented around the world. We're able to kind of coordinate with a relatively small number of people. On the other hand, we face a lot of, not me specifically, but a lot of my Chinese colleagues are running into transnational repression issues. So,
Mm.
it's a tiny city, but the battle for it is being played out globally. And yeah, it's just fascinating. And obviously we're going to win. We want to win. It's not just a game, but it's a battle.
Yeah. What is winning?
Huh. Uh, it's winning. Well, the first thing is to get political prisoners out of jail and to start having some kind of a thaw in Hong Kong where people are able to at least wear a t-shirt, that's anti-government, just some kind of easing. I mean, the ultimate victory, of course, is the end of the CCP and democracy in China. But I mean, that's not our focus, So winning for us is a release of political prisoners and China living up to the basic law in the Sino-British Declaration. It's pretty basic, actually.
With that, this is the end of our episode. I hope you liked it. You can follow us wherever you get your podcasts, on YouTube, Apple Podcast, you name it. And do feel free to also subscribe to our Substack, where there's a nice community of Peking hotelers. And so with that, I will talk to you next time.